The transmission arrived at the Galactic Concord headquarters during the quiet hours when most species were resting in their designated chambers. The signal was weak at first, barely a whisper among the constant chatter of 1,000 civilizations, but the automated systems flagged it immediately. The source was a frontier observation post at the edge of explored space, and the classification code attached to the message made every receiving station go silent. Ambassador was pulled from his meditation chamber by his assistant, a young named Myra who had never seen her superior move so quickly. The ambassador's forearms were still adjusting his formal robes as he rushed through the curved corridors toward the central communication hub. Other diplomats and officials were emerging from their quarters as well, their faces marked by confusion and the early stirrings of fear. The hub was already crowded when arrived. Representatives from a dozen species stood before the massive holographic display, their voices overlapping in a dozen languages until the translation systems could barely keep pace. Pushed his way to the front and raised one arm for silence. The room fell quiet. The data floated before them like a nightmare-given form, a small blue world orbiting a yellow star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. The planet was designated by a string of numbers in the official records, but its inhabitants called it Earth. And according to the observation post, those inhabitants had just achieved faster-than-light travel. This alone would have been cause for celebration under normal circumstances. The Concord existed to welcome new species into the galactic community, to share knowledge and resources across the vast emptiness of space. But Earth was not a normal world. Earth was classified as a Class 7 death world, and no species from such a place had ever achieved. Pulled up the environmental data and felt his secondary hearts begin to race. The temperature variations on Earth's surface ranged across extremes that would kill most known species within hours. The planet experienced violent atmospheric phenomena that could level cities in moments. The ecosystems were filled with predators at every level, creatures that hunted and consumed one another in endless cycles of death. The ground itself was unstable, prone to sudden violent shifts that could swallow entire regions. And the star that gave the planet life also bombarded it with radiation that would cause cellular damage in most galactic species. No sentient life should have evolved there. The mathematical models were clear on this point. Death worlds occasionally produced simple organisms, hardy bacteria and primitive plants that clung to existence through sheer chemical stubbornness. But complex life, thinking life, civilized life with technology and culture, and the ability to reach for the stars. This was not supposed to happen. Yet somehow it had. The observation post had been monitoring Earth for several generations, watching with morbid fascination as the humans, as they called themselves, clawed their way up from primitive tribes to industrial societies. The reports described wars of staggering brutality, plagues that killed millions, famines and droughts and disasters that would have ended most species. But the humans kept going. They buried their dead and rebuilt their cities and continued to multiply across their hostile world. Had read these reports before with the detached interest of a scholar studying ancient history. Now, staring at the confirmation that these death had built ships capable of crossing the stars, he felt that detachment crumble into dust. The emergency session of the Concord began within the hour. Representatives from every member species crowded into the great chamber, their translators working overtime to convey the fear and confusion that rippled through the assembly. Some called for immediate quarantine, a blockade around the Sol system that would prevent the humans from ever spreading beyond their corner of space. Others went further, suggesting that the threat should be eliminated before it could grow. A few voices, considered naive by most present, argued for diplomacy and peaceful contact. The debate raged for 3 full cycles. Listened to every argument, his mind turning over the possibilities like stones in a river. The humans were unknown, untested, potentially dangerous. But they were also clearly intelligent, clearly capable of great achievements despite their impossible circumstances. Was it right to condemn them simply for surviving where they should have died? In the end, fear won. The vote passed by a narrow margin and the decision was made. A containment fleet would be dispatched to the Sol system. The humans would be given a choice: submit to permanent quarantine and oversight or face the consequences of resistance. Commander N was chosen to lead the fleet. He was a veteran of 100 campaigns, a strategist who had never known defeat. His species, were among the most militarily powerful in the Conquered, and N was their finest officer. When he received his orders, he accepted them without hesitation. The fleet assembled over the following weeks. 12 species contributed ships, a show of unity meant to demonstrate the full might of galactic civilization. N stood on the bridge of his flagship and reviewed the intelligence reports on the humans with cool professional interest. He noted their physical capabilities, their technological level, their apparent social structures. They were adaptable, according to the reports, resilient, stubborn to the point of irrationality. None of this concerned him. The humans were primitives who had barely scratched the surface of. They had no shields, no weapons capable of threatening conquered vessels, no experience with interstellar conflict. Whatever survival instincts had carried them through their death world would mean nothing against the combined military power of a dozen advanced civilizations. As the fleet entered faster-than-light transit toward the Sol system, N allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. This mission would be simple. The humans would see the armada surrounding their world, understand the hopelessness of resistance and submit. If they chose to fight, they would be destroyed quickly and efficiently. Either way, the threat would be contained. He did not know that at that very moment, a small human exploration vessel called the Pioneer 7 was making its maiden voyage beyond the boundaries of the Sol system. He did not know that the 5 humans aboard that ship were about to change everything. He did not know that in the coming weeks, his certainty would crumble, his understanding of courage would be rewritten, and his entire view of the galaxy would be transformed. Commander N was confident. He had faced countless enemies and emerged victorious every time. The humans were primitives from a nightmare world. They could not possibly resist. He was wrong. The Pioneer 7 was not an impressive vessel by any standard. It was small, barely larger than the cargo shuttles that moved supplies between orbital stations back home. Its hull was patched in 3 places where micrometeorites had tested the integrity of human engineering. Its engines hummed with a sound that the chief engineer insisted was normal, but that no one else found reassuring. But to the 5 humans aboard, it was the most beautiful thing ever built, because it was taking them to the stars. Captain Laura Mitchell stood at the forward viewport, watching the impossible blackness of interstellar space stretch out before her. She was 43 years old, with gray streaks beginning to show in her dark hair and lines around her eyes from too many years of squinting at readouts in dimly lit control rooms. She had spent her entire career preparing for this moment, training and studying and pushing through every obstacle that stood between humanity and the void. Now she was here, and the reality of it left her breathless. Behind her, the rest of the crew went about their duties with the quiet efficiency of people who trusted each other completely. Danny Reeves sat at the pilot station, his fingers dancing over the controls with an ease that came from thousands of hours in simulators and atmospheric craft. He was the youngest of the crew at 31, with a quick smile and a quicker wit that had kept spirits high during the long months of preparation. Carlos Vega hunched over the engineering console, monitoring the reactor output and the integrity of systems that he understood better than their original designers. He was a stocky man with thick forearms and permanent grease stains on his fingers that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He spoke rarely, but when he did, everyone listened, because Carlos never wasted words on anything that was not important. Doctor occupied the small science station at the rear of the bridge, her eyes moving constantly between multiple displays showing sensor data and environmental readings. She was there, trained to study and understand life forms that no human had ever encountered. So far, her instruments had found nothing but empty space, but she remained alert. The galaxy was vast, and they had barely begun to explore it. Park handled communications, his station a mess of cables and modified equipment that he had personally upgraded to extend their range and sensitivity. He was constantly adjusting frequencies, listening for signals that might indicate the presence of other intelligent life. So far, he had heard only the background noise of the cosmos, the whisper of distant stars and the echoes of ancient explosions, but was patient. He knew that first contact, when it came, would happen through his station. The alert came on their seventh day beyond the solar system. Straightened in his chair, his hands freezing over his controls as the displays before him lit up with impossible data. He checked the readings 3 times before turning to face Captain Mitchell, his face pale. Multiple contacts were approaching at faster-than-light speeds, dozens of them, no hundreds. The signatures were unlike anything in their limited database, but the conclusion was inescapable. These were artificial vessels. These were ships. And they were heading directly for the Pioneer 7. The crew gathered around station, staring at the readings in stunned silence. This was what they had hoped for, what humanity had dreamed of for centuries, proof that they were not alone in the universe. But something about the approach patterns made Laura's stomach tighten with unease. The vessels were spreading out as they drew closer, forming a sphere that would surround the Pioneer 7 completely. This did not look like a welcoming party. This looked like a trap. She made her decision quickly. Running was not an option. Their faster-than-light drive needed hours to recharge between jumps, and the alien vessels were moving far faster than anything human engineers had yet achieved. Fighting was equally impossible. The Pioneer 7 carried no weapons beyond a small laser designed for clearing debris. Whatever was coming, they would have to face it with words alone. Laura ordered to broadcast a greeting. He compiled a message using 17 different mathematical languages, hoping that universal constants and geometric principles would bridge whatever gap existed between human and alien minds. The transmission went out in all directions, a beacon of peaceful intent in the vast darkness. The alien fleet did not slow down. Within the hour, the Pioneer 7 was surrounded. Ships of every size and configuration filled the viewports, their hulls gleaming with technologies that made human engineering look like children playing with blocks. Laura counted at least 12 distinct design philosophies, suggesting that this was not a single species but a coalition. Whatever organization these beings represented, it was vast and powerful beyond anything humanity had imagined. The response came as a burst of data that nearly overwhelmed systems. He worked frantically to decode it, pulling meaning from patterns that his software had never been designed to recognize. When he finally understood enough to translate, his voice was hollow. The message was an ultimatum. The Pioneer 7 and its crew were to surrender immediately. Humanity was to submit to permanent quarantine within their home system. Any resistance would be met with destruction. There was no mention of negotiation, no offer of dialogue. The alien coalition had already decided what humans were, and they had decided that humans were a threat. Laura listened to the translation and felt something cold settle in her chest. She looked at her crew, at the faces of the 4 people who had trusted her with their lives, and she saw fear there. But she also saw something else. She saw the same stubborn defiance that had carried humanity through ice ages and plagues and wars, the same refusal to surrender that had defined their species since the first humans looked up at the stars and decided to reach for them. She keyed the communication channel and spoke clearly, knowing that whatever translation systems the aliens possessed would carry her words to every ship in the fleet. We will not submit. We did not survive our world by running. We will not start now. The alien commander, a being called N, heard these words in his private chamber and felt something stir in his chest that he did not recognize. It might have been curiosity. It might have been respect. Or it might have been the first faint stirring of fear. The standoff had begun. The first cycle passed without incident. The alien fleet maintained its position around the Pioneer 7, weapons powered but not firing, waiting for the humans to see reason and surrender. Commander N was patient. He had conducted sieges before, and he knew that time was always on the side of the force with superior resources. The human vessel was small and clearly limited in its supplies. They would break eventually. They always did. The second cycle passed, then the third, then the 10th. The humans did not surrender. N began receiving reports from his officers that troubled him. The human vessel was showing no signs of distress. Its reactor continued to function at stable levels. Its life support systems remained operational. The 5 life signs aboard remained steady, showing no indication of the panic or desperation that should have set in by now. By the 20th cycle, N had begun to study the human crew directly through long-range sensors. What he observed made no sense to him. The humans moved about their vessel with calm purpose, performing maintenance and conducting repairs as though they were on a routine mission rather than surrounded by hundreds of warships. They ate their meals at regular intervals, though the portions grew smaller as time passed. They slept in shifts, never leaving their stations unattended. They even appeared to be laughing at times, sharing jokes that N could not hear but could see in the way their bodies shook and their faces contorted. How could they laugh? How could they find humor in this situation? They were trapped, outnumbered, and running out of resources. Any rational species would have surrendered by now. Any rational species would have accepted the inevitable and sought to preserve their lives. But the humans were not rational. The humans were something else entirely. Inside the Pioneer 7, Captain Laura Mitchell held the crew together through sheer force of will. The rations had been cut to half portions by the 15th cycle, and the water recycler had started making concerning noises that kept Carlos awake at night. The air scrubbers were working overtime, and the temperature inside the ship fluctuated as power was diverted from comfort systems to essential functions. None of this was new to humans. Their ancestors had crossed oceans in wooden ships, had survived winters that killed entire herds, had endured famines and droughts and disasters that would have ended weaker species. The crew of the Pioneer 7 carried that legacy in their bones, and they drew on it now without even thinking about it. Carlos performed miracles with the failing systems. He cannibalized equipment from non-essential sections of the ship, repurposing components in ways their manufacturers had never intended. When the water recycler finally broke down completely, he built a replacement from spare parts and determination. It was ugly and it made a sound like a dying animal, but it worked. That was all that mattered. Found ways to stretch their food supplies that bordered on genius. She identified nutrients that could be extracted from materials they had previously considered waste, supplementing their dwindling rations with proteins and vitamins that kept them functioning when their bodies should have begun to fail. She lost weight like all of them, her cheeks growing hollow and her eyes developing dark circles, but her mind remained sharp and her hands remained steady. Never stopped listening. Even as the siege stretched on and their situation grew more desperate, he kept his station active, monitoring alien communications and slowly building a vocabulary from the fragments he intercepted. The aliens used dozens of languages, but patterns emerged over time and began to understand bits and pieces of what they were saying. Most of it was tactical chatter, ship positions and supply reports. But sometimes he caught something else. Conversations between alien officers about the strange creatures who refused to give up. They were afraid. The aliens, with their hundreds of ships and their advanced technology and their vast galactic civilization, were afraid of 5 humans in a dying vessel. Shared this observation with the crew, and for the first time in weeks, genuine laughter filled the bridge. On the 47th cycle, Laura made a decision. They had survived this long through stubborn endurance, but endurance alone would not change anything. The aliens were waiting for them to break, and while the humans had no intention of breaking, they needed to do something more than simply survive. They needed to make the aliens understand what they were dealing with. She gathered the crew and explained her plan. It was simple, perhaps foolish, but it felt right. Had recovered enough of the alien communication protocols to broadcast a signal that every ship in the fleet would receive. Laura wanted to send them something that would speak louder than words. She wanted to send them music. The crew spent hours selecting the songs. Old recordings from Earth, pieces that had survived centuries and crossed cultural boundaries, melodies that humans had sung in their darkest hours. Songs about perseverance and hope and refusing to give up. Songs that had been written during wars and plagues and disasters. Songs that had helped humanity survive when survival seemed impossible. The transmission went out on the 48th cycle. Every ship in the alien fleet received it simultaneously, and for a few moments, the tactical chatter went silent. Commander N sat in his private chamber and listened. The sounds were unlike anything in his experience, patterns of vibration arranged in ways that stirred something deep within his neural structure. He did not understand the words, but he understood the emotion behind them. These were the sounds of a species that had faced extinction countless times and refused to accept it. These were the sounds of creatures who found beauty in darkness and strength in despair. Throughout the fleet, other aliens listened as well. Some dismissed the transmission as primitive noise, but others found themselves moved in ways they could not explain, though with their sensitive hearing, wept openly. The N's own species stood in rigid silence as the music washed over them, their trained discipline cracking around the edges. When the transmission ended, the fleet remained silent for a long time. Something had changed, though no one could say exactly what. The humans in their tiny vessel had done something that no weapon could accomplish. They had made the galaxy listen. And for the first time, the galaxy was beginning to understand. The message from the Galactic Concord arrived on the 52nd cycle, and its contents left no room for interpretation. Commander N was ordered to end the siege immediately. The human vessel was to be destroyed, and the fleet was to proceed to the Sol system to establish a permanent quarantine around the Death World. The Council had grown impatient. The spectacle of 5 primitives defying the might of galactic civilization had become an embarrassment that could no longer be tolerated. N read the orders 3 times, his mind moving slowly through territory it had never explored. Obedience had been the foundation of his entire career. He had followed orders without question for longer than most species lived, and that discipline had brought him success and honor beyond measure. But something had changed during the long weeks of the siege. Something had shifted in the foundations of his understanding. He thought about the humans in their failing vessel. He thought about the music they had broadcast, those strange patterns of sound that had stirred emotions he did not know he possessed. He thought about the way they had endured when any rational species would have surrendered, the way they had laughed in the face of certain defeat, the way they had refused to let fear control them. What kind of creatures were these? What kind of world produced beings who could look at death and simply refuse to accept it? He pulled up the environmental data on Earth once more, the files he had reviewed dozens of times during the siege. The temperature extremes, the violent storms, the predators and diseases and natural disasters that made the planet a constant struggle for survival. Any sane species would have fled such a world at the first opportunity, would have sought out gentler environments where life did not have to fight for every breath. But the humans had not fled. They had stayed and fought and built civilizations in the teeth of a world that wanted them dead. They had turned their hostile environment into a crucible that forged them into something the galaxy had never seen before. They were not monsters. They were survivors, and N was beginning to understand that there was a profound difference between the two. He made his decision in the quiet of his private chamber, with no witnesses and no counsel. It was the first truly independent choice he had made in centuries, and the weight of it settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. But it also felt right in a way that his endless obedience never had. He opened a private communication channel to the Pioneer 7, bypassing his own officers and the official protocols that governed contact with primitive species. The signal was encrypted with codes that only his rank could access, ensuring that no one would intercept what he was about to say. Laura Mitchell answered the hail herself. Her face filled his display, thin and exhausted, but with eyes that burned with undiminished fire. She did not speak, simply waited for him to explain why the commander of the fleet that had besieged her for nearly 2 months was suddenly calling her directly. N asked her one question. It was the question that had been forming in his mind since the siege began, the question that the music had crystallized into words. Why do you not fear death? Laura's answer came without hesitation, as though she had been waiting for someone to ask. We fear death more than you can imagine. We have always feared it. Our world has been trying to kill us since before we could walk upright, and every moment of our existence has been shadowed by the knowledge that it could end at any time. But we learned something long ago, something that your species never had to learn because your worlds were kind enough to let you live in peace. She paused, and En saw something in her eyes that he could not name. It might have been sorrow, it might have been pride, it might have been both. We learned that fear is not the enemy. Fear is a tool, a warning system that tells us when something matters. The enemy is letting fear control you, letting it make your decisions and shape your life. We are afraid right now. Every one of us on this ship is terrified, but we choose to act despite that fear because there are things worth dying for. Freedom, dignity, the right to stand as equals with any species in the galaxy, the chance to show our children that they come from a people who never surrendered. She leaned closer to the screen, and her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. Fear does not control us. It never has. That is why we survived our world. That is why we will survive this. En closed the channel and sat in silence for a long time. Outside his viewport, the Pioneer 7 hung in space, tiny and fragile against the backdrop of stars. Inside that vessel, 5 humans waited for a death that might come at any moment, and they waited with courage that put his entire civilization to shame. He contacted the conquered and delivered his report. His voice was steady as he described the destruction of the human vessel during an attempted escape. The primitives had been desperate and foolish, and their ship had been vaporized in moments. There was no debris worth recovering, no survivors to interrogate. The threat had been neutralized. The council accepted his report without question. Why would they doubt him? He was Commander N, their most trusted officer, their champion who had never failed them. He ordered his fleet to withdraw, and as the ships engaged their faster-than-light drives and vanished into the void, he watched the Pioneer 7 grow smaller on his screens until it was just another point of light among millions. His career was over. When the truth eventually emerged, and it would emerge, he would be stripped of his rank and his honor and probably his freedom. But as he watched the tiny human vessel limp toward its home system, damaged but undefeated, he felt something he had not felt in centuries. He felt hope. Hope that the galaxy might yet learn what the humans had to teach. Hope that courage and dignity and the refusal to surrender might spread from that little death world to every corner of civilized space. The humans were free, and N, for the first time in his long life, understood what freedom truly meant. 3 standard years passed, and the galaxy changed in ways that no one had predicted. The Pioneer 7 returned to Earth with its crew alive, and its mission transformed from exploration to first contact. The story of the siege spread across the planet within days, carried by every news network and discussed in every government chamber. Humanity learned that it was not alone in the universe, and it learned that the universe was afraid of them. The reaction was not what the aliens might have expected. There was no panic, no calls for military buildup, no retreat into isolation. Instead, humanity did what it had always done when faced with a challenge. It adapted, it prepared, it reached out. The governments of Earth united behind a single purpose for the first time in history. Resources that had been spent on conflicts between nations were redirected toward understanding the galaxy that had tried to cage them. Linguists worked to decode the alien languages that Park had captured during the siege. Scientists studied the fragments of data about alien technology that the Pioneer 7 sensors had recorded. Diplomats developed protocols for contact with species that humans had never imagined. And at the center of it all, Laura Mitchell worked tirelessly to shape humanity's response. She had been offered every honor her world could bestow, but she had refused them all. There was no time for ceremonies. There was work to be done. The news of Commander N's deception reached the Galactic Concord 18 months after the siege ended. A routine audit of fleet movements revealed inconsistencies that could not be explained, and the investigation that followed uncovered the truth. The human vessel had not been destroyed. The Death had been allowed to escape. The outrage was immediate and overwhelming. N was arrested and brought before the council in chains, his centuries of service forgotten in the face of his betrayal. The council demanded to know why he had done it, why he had thrown away everything he had built to save 5 primitives from a nightmare world. His answer was simple: because they deserved to be free, because they showed me something I had forgotten, because fear is a poor foundation for civilization. The council sentenced him to exile, the harshest punishment short of death that their laws allowed. But his words spread through the diplomatic channels and the unofficial networks that connected the galaxy. Other species heard what he had said, and some of them began to wonder if he might be right. The Second Fleet was assembled over the following year. 200 warships from 15 species, the largest armada the Conquered had ever gathered. This time there would be no siege, no ultimatums, no chance for the humans to display their unsettling resilience. The fleet would enter the Sol system and establish quarantine by force, and any resistance would be crushed immediately and permanently. The Armada entered the Sol system on a bright morning by Earth's reckoning, their ships blocking out the stars as they took up positions around the blue-green world that had produced such impossible creatures. They expected panic. They expected desperate calls for negotiation. They expected the Death to finally show the fear that all rational species felt when faced with overwhelming force. Instead, they received an invitation. The transmission came from Earth's surface, broadcast on every frequency the aliens used. It was simple and direct, translated into every language that humanity had managed to decode. The humans welcomed the Armada to their system. They apologized for any alarm their expansion into space had caused, and they offered a gift. The ships of the Armada began receiving packages of data almost immediately. The files were enormous, containing millions of items organized into categories that the alien system struggled to process. There was music, thousands of compositions spanning human history. There was art, paintings and sculptures and photographs that captured the human experience across centuries. There was literature, stories and poems and philosophical works that explored every aspect of existence. There was science, discoveries made by humans working alone or in teams, breakthroughs achieved in laboratories and workshops, and sometimes in prisons and refugee camps. The data included context for everything. This symphony was written during a plague that killed millions. This painting was created in a city under siege. This scientific paper was authored by a woman who had fled her homeland with nothing but the clothes on her back. Again and again, the pattern repeated. Humans creating beauty and knowledge in the midst of suffering. Humans building something meaningful from the ruins of disaster. The final item in the transmission was a video message from Laura Mitchell, now holding the title of ambassador though she had not sought it. Her face had filled out since the siege, and her hair showed more gray than before, but her eyes still held that same fire that had Commander N and his entire fleet. We are not your enemies. We never were. We are survivors of a world that tried to kill us, and we have learned lessons that we want to share. We know what it means to struggle. We know what it means to lose everything and build again. We know that fear is a poor master and that hope is stronger than any weapon. She paused, and her expression softened into something that might have been compassion. "Come, learn from us, teach us. We have so much to share with each other, and the galaxy is too vast for any of us to face alone." The Armada did not fire. On ship after ship, weapons were powered down and attack formations dissolved into confusion. The captains argued among themselves, some demanding that they follow their orders while others pointed to the data still streaming into their systems and asked what kind of monsters created such beauty. One by one, the ships accepted the invitation. They descended into orbit around Earth, not as conquerors but as guests. Shuttlecraft began moving between the Armada and the surface, carrying aliens who had come expecting to enforce quarantine and found themselves instead attending what humans called a welcome party. The Galactic Concord convened an emergency session to deal with the crisis, but the crisis had already resolved itself. The species of the galaxy had seen what humanity had to offer, and they wanted more. The vote to admit humans to the Concord passed by an overwhelming margin, with only a handful of holdouts still clinging to their fear. Ambassador cast the first vote in favor. He was old now, his scales dulling and his movements slower than they had been 3 years ago when the first warning about the death had arrived. But his mind was still sharp, and he understood what was happening better than most of his colleagues. The humans could not be stopped because they had never been the enemy. They were a mirror, reflecting back the fear and the hope that existed in every species. The galaxy had looked at them and seen monsters because the galaxy had been afraid. Now, finally, the galaxy was learning to see something else. N was released from exile and offered a position as humanity's first advocate on the Concord. He accepted, though he insisted on meeting Laura Mitchell first. Their conversation lasted for hours, two beings from opposite ends of the galaxy discovering how much they had in common. When they emerged, both of them were smiling. The galaxy had watched humanity with fear for as long as it had known they existed. The inhabitants of the death world seemed too stubborn, too resilient, too impossibly determined to be controlled or contained. And in the end, that was exactly why they could not be stopped. Not because they were dangerous, not because they were frightening, but because they carried within them a light that the galaxy had forgotten it was missing, a light called hope.